The restaurant was busy tonight, full of chattering patrons and wait staff. Rosa the cleaner, no one paid her any attention as she quietly sat up in a corner, pulling out her mop and bucket. She liked it that way, blending into the background, where no one could see the pain in her eyes or the exhaustion in her body. She dipped the mop into the soapy water and started scrubbing the floor near the bar, careful not to get in anyone's way. This was how she lived now, quietly, unnoticed. "Excuse me," barked a sharp voice behind her. Rosa straightened. A young man in a pressed shirt stood there, arms crossed and a scowl on his face. "Yes, sir?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You missed a spot over there," the man said, pointing to a section near the entrance. His tone was impatient and dismissive. Rosa glanced over at the floor where he pointed. It was clean, spotless even, but she didn't argue. She had learned long ago that it wasn't worth it. Bowing her head slightly, she nodded. "Of course, I'll take care of it right away, sir," she said. The man gave a quick, irritated nod and walked away without another word. Rosa watched him go, her heart sinking. She had been working here for a month now, and still, no one knew her name. Not even the manager, Mark. That was his name. He was young, sharp-eyed, and ambitious. Rosa saw the way he moved around the restaurant, directing people with quick, efficient gestures. He was respected, maybe even feared, but there was no kindness in him. At least, none that Rosa had seen. She sighed and continued mopping, her hands trembling slightly from the effort. She had done harder jobs in her life, but somehow this one felt heavier. The weight of her secrets made her steps slower, her work harder. But no one could know. Especially not Mark. Mark stormed through the kitchen doors, his jaw clenched tight. The place was packed tonight, and nothing seemed to be going right. A table of 10 had just sent back their dishes, complaining about the temperature of the food, and one of the waitresses had spilled wine all over a customer's dress. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath as he passed the line of cooks who were frantically trying to keep up with orders. He pulled at the collar of his shirt, loosening the tie around his neck. He couldn't afford to mess this up, not tonight, not with potential investors sitting in the dining area, watching his every move. He pushed through the staff, heading straight for the back office. Once inside, he slammed the door behind him and slumped into his chair. Rubbing his temples, he tried to focus, but the headache pounding in his skull wouldn't go away. It had been like this for weeks. The restaurant was doing well, but it wasn't enough. He needed more success, more recognition. He had plans to expand, to turn this place into a chain, but with all the little setbacks and mistakes piling up, his patience was wearing thin. His phone buzzed on the desk. Mark glanced at it, seeing a message from one of the investors. Mark cursed under his breath. He quickly typed a response, just a small hiccup. Nothing to worry about. He knew they were watching, scrutinizing his every move. One mistake could cost him everything. Taking a deep breath, he sat up straighter and reached for the pile of invoices on his desk. If he couldn't control everything out there, at least he could make sure the numbers were perfect. As he scanned the papers, his eyes drifted to the framed photo sitting on the corner of his desk, an old picture from when he was a child. Barely 3 or 4 years old, with a woman smiling beside him, his foster mother. She had raised him well, but there was always something missing, a gap in his life that no amount of success could fill. He had no memories of his real mother, no answers as to why she had abandoned him. Mark shook his head and turned back to the invoices. Dwelling on the past wasn't going to help him now. Rosa was finishing up in the dining room when she felt someone approach behind her. She turned to see Mark standing there, his eyes scanning the floor critically. "Make sure this whole area is spotless before you leave tonight," he said, his voice cold and detached. "We've got important guests coming in tomorrow morning, and I don't want them seeing any mess." Rosa nodded quickly, avoiding his gaze. "Yes, sir." Mark glanced at her, barely giving her a second thought. She was just one of the cleaning staff, someone he didn't have time to worry about. He had bigger problems to deal with. But for a moment, his eyes lingered on her, something flickering in the back of his mind, a feeling he couldn't understand. "Just make sure it's done," he said before turning and walking away, leaving Rosa standing there in silence. As he walked away, Rosa's heart ached. She had been so close to him, close enough to see the face she hadn't seen in years, the face that had haunted her dreams. But he didn't know. He didn't recognize her, and maybe, she thought bitterly, it was better that way. Later that night, Rosa sat in her small apartment, the faint sound of traffic drifting through the window. She sipped on a cup of tea, her hands shaking slightly from the cold that had settled in her bones. The apartment was sparse, just a bed, a table, and a few personal belongings she had managed to hold onto over the years. She pulled an old, worn-out photograph from her purse and stared at it. It was faded, the edges torn, but she could still make out the image. A young boy, no more than 3 years old, sitting on her lap, smiling. Her son. Rosa felt a tear slide down her cheek. She had searched for him for years, moving from place to place, working whatever jobs she could find. But fate had been cruel, and she had never been able to find him, until now. Now, he was so close. And yet, he was a stranger. She had watched him grow from afar, seen the man he had become. But he had no idea who she was. And she couldn't tell him. Not yet. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the photo, her voice trembling. "I never wanted to leave you." But life hadn't given her a choice. All she could do now was stay close, even if he never knew the truth. The next day, Mark was back in the restaurant, his focus sharper than ever. He prowled the dining room like a hawk, watching every detail, from the placement of the silverware to the expressions on the faces of his staff. The morning rush had started, and there was no room for error. As he passed by the cleaning station, he spotted Rosa wiping down the tables, her movements slow and deliberate. His jaw tightened. The investors would be arriving soon, and the last thing he needed was for the place to look less than perfect. He marched over to her, his steps quick and purposeful. "Rosa!" he barked. The old woman flinched slightly, pausing in her task. "Yes, sir?" she answered, turning toward him with downcast eyes. Mark pointed to the far corner of the room, where a few crumbs lay scattered near the base of a table. "You missed that," he said sharply. "I need this place spotless. Do you understand? No mistakes." Rosa looked to where he pointed, then nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. I'll take care of it right away." Mark stood there for a moment, watching her. Something about the way she moved, the quiet obedience in her manner, unsettled him. She reminded him of someone he couldn't quite place. But he pushed the thought away. It didn't matter. She was just an employee, and he had a restaurant to run. "Good," he said curtly, before turning on his heel and walking away. Rosa's hands trembled as she wiped the table again. She had endured worse in her life, but the pain of seeing her son, her own flesh and blood, treat her like a stranger was almost too much to bear. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. There was nothing she could do. Not yet. She would wait, as she always had, until the time was right. Later that evening, as the staff cleared out for the night, Rosa lingered behind. She moved slowly through the empty dining room, her eyes scanning the quiet space. The long hours were wearing on her body, but her mind was elsewhere, on the photograph she had found a few days ago. After finishing her cleaning, she made her way back to her small apartment. It wasn't much, just a modest space with a bed, a small kitchen, and a few old belongings she had managed to keep over the years. But it was hers, and that was enough. Rosa sat down at the worn table in the center of the room and pulled out the small, crinkled photograph from her purse. She stared at it, her heart tightening in her chest. The photo was old, faded at the edges. In it, a young boy with curly hair smiled up at the camera. Rosa could barely remember the day it was taken, But the boy in the picture, her son, was seared into her memory. Her fingers traced the boy's face. Mark, she thought. My son. She had lost him so many years ago, forced to leave him behind when her life had spiraled out of control. She had never forgiven herself for it, never stopped searching for him. And now, by some cruel twist of fate, she had found him again, but he didn't know. The ache in her heart grew stronger as she thought of the way he had spoken to her. The coldness in his eyes. He didn't recognize her, and she couldn't blame him. She had been gone too long, missed too much. But even though he didn't know who she was, she still loved him. She had always loved him. Rosa carefully placed the photograph back into her purse, a small tear escaping her eye. She didn't know how long she could keep this secret, but for now, she had no choice. It was too late to change the past, but maybe, just maybe, she could still find a way to heal the future. Rosa stood in front of the restaurant early the next morning, clutching her coat tightly around her frail body as the wind whipped through the street. She had come to a decision. She couldn't tell Mark the truth, not yet. As much as her heart longed to see the recognition in his eyes, to hear him call her mother, Rosa knew it wasn't the right time. He had his own life now, his own dreams and ambitions. Telling him who she really was would only disrupt everything. He wouldn't understand, and worse, he might never forgive her. With a deep breath, she walked through the back door of the restaurant, nodding quietly to the other staff as she made her way to the cleaning closet. She would continue working here, as painful as it was, staying close to him without revealing her true identity. If this was the only way she could be near him, then so be it. Mark stood in front of the long mirror in his office, adjusting his tie and checking his watch. The investors were due to arrive in just under an hour, and everything had to be perfect. He glanced over his reflection one more time, making sure the lines of his suit were sharp and precise. Tonight was the night that could change everything for him. He had spent years building this restaurant from the ground up, turning it into one of the most popular spots in the city. But it wasn't enough. He wanted more. He wanted to expand, to open more locations and build a brand that would outlast him. As he adjusted his cufflinks, his thoughts drifted to the past. He had done all of this on his own. No family, no connections. He had been raised by strangers, taken in by a foster family who had cared for him, but there was always something missing. He had never known his real mother, never understood why she had left him behind. With a deep breath, he shook off the thought. He couldn't afford to think about the past right now. Tonight was about the future. He had a chance to impress these investors, to secure the funding he needed to take his restaurant to the next level. He stepped out of his office, heading back into the dining area where the staff was putting the final touches on the setup. Rosa was there, mopping the floor near the entrance. Mark's eyes lingered on her for a moment, but he quickly turned away. She was just part of the staff, he reminded himself. Just another person doing their job. He had more important things to worry about. The investors had arrived, and everything was running smoothly, until it wasn't. One of the waitresses tripped over a cord near the bar, sending a tray of drinks crashing to the floor. The sound echoed through the restaurant, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. Mark's face flushed with anger as he rushed over to the scene. His jaw clenched tight. What the hell happened here? He snapped, his voice low but laced with fury. The waitress, a young woman with wide eyes, stammered an apology as she tried to pick up the broken glass. "I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't see the cord. I don't care about excuses," Mark cut her off, his tone cold. "Get this cleaned up, and make sure it doesn't happen again." He turned his attention to Rosa, who was standing nearby with her mop in hand. "You clean this up," he ordered sharply. Rosa nodded quickly, hurrying over to the mess. She knelt down, carefully mopping up the spilled drinks and picking up the broken glass. Her hands shook slightly as she worked, the harshness of Mark's words echoing in her mind. "Faster," Mark snapped, his eyes narrowing. "We don't have all night." Rosa worked as quickly as her frail body would allow, but it wasn't enough for Mark. He sighed in frustration, running a hand through his hair. "If you can't keep up, maybe you should think about retiring," he muttered under his breath, but loud enough for her to hear. Rosa's heart clenched at his words, but she said nothing. She kept her head down, focusing on the task at hand. She wouldn't let his harshness break her. She couldn't. I'll continue with the next set of chapters soon, delving deeper into Rosa's internal conflict and Mark's journey toward the truth. Let me know if you're happy with the direction or if you'd like any adjustments. The night was winding down, but the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mark was pacing near the bar, checking his watch every few minutes, his eyes darting toward the investors who were still seated at their table. The meeting had gone well so far, but it wasn't over yet, and every little mistake was starting to grate on him. Rosa, her back aching, was quietly wiping down a table near the front. Her hands moved slowly, methodically, but each time Mark glanced at her, his frustration grew. She wasn't fast enough, wasn't sharp enough. She was dragging down the image he needed to present tonight. "Rosa!" he barked suddenly, striding over to her with heavy steps. "How many times do I have to tell you to pick up the pace?" Rosa flinched but kept her eyes lowered. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll be faster," she whispered. "Sorry isn't good enough," Mark snapped, his voice rising. "I've got investors sitting right there, and you're moving like you've got all the time in the world." Rosa bit her lip, the sting of his words cutting deeper than she let on. She knew she wasn't as quick as the younger staff, but she was trying her best. Still, she kept her head down and nodded. Mark took a step closer, his eyes blazing with anger. "If you can't keep up with the work, then maybe you should consider finding a new job. I can't have you dragging this place down." Rosa's hand shook as she continued to wipe the table, but she said nothing. The words he threw at her cut deep. Find a new job. But she couldn't leave, not now, not when her son was standing right in front of her, even if he didn't know it. "You've got one more chance, Rosa," Mark said, his voice a dangerous whisper. One more. Without waiting for a response, he turned and stormed off toward the kitchen, leaving Rosa standing there, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. As the restaurant closed for the night, Mark sat alone in his office, his head in his hands. The investors had left with promises of a future meeting, but he could sense their hesitation. One of them had commented on the cleanliness of the dining room. Another had remarked about the slow service. All minor things, but Mark knew how much they could add up. His mind wandered to Rosa, the old woman who seemed to be a constant thorn in his side. She was too slow, too weak, too old for this kind of work. He had tried to be patient, but tonight had been the last straw. Something about her frustrated him more than any other employee ever had. He didn't understand why, but every time he looked at her, something in him bristled, like an old wound being poked. Her silence, her downcast eyes, the way she never argued back, it all irritated him in ways he couldn't explain. The sound of shuffling outside his door pulled him out of his thoughts. He glanced up just as Rosa passed by, her frail figure barely visible through the crack in the door. Mark stood up, something cold and sharp tightening in his chest. He opened the door and called out, "Rosa." She stopped, turning slowly to face him, her eyes tired and hollow. "Yes, sir?" she asked quietly. Mark stepped forward, his frustration boiling over. "Why are you still here? The restaurant's closed. You're done for the night. I was just finishing up," Rosa said softly, clutching the mop handle with trembling hands. "Well, you're finished now," Mark said, his voice cold. "You've done enough." Rosa hesitated, her eyes flicking to the floor. "I doubt I just wanted to make sure everything was clean." Mark's anger flared. "It's never clean enough, is it? No matter how much you mop, you still miss things. Maybe it's time you admit you're not cut out for this job anymore." Rosa swallowed hard, the ache in her heart growing unbearable. She had endured worse in her life, but hearing those words from her own son, words he didn't even know he was saying to his mother, was almost too much. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'll be better." Mark shook his head, his patience long gone. "You're not listening, Rosa. I don't want you to be better. I want you gone. Do you understand that? This is your last night here. Don't come back tomorrow." Rosa felt the words like a blow to her chest. She had known this day would come, but hearing it from him, from Mark, was more painful than she had imagined. Without another word, she nodded and turned away, her footsteps slow and heavy as she left the restaurant for what she thought might be the last time. Rosa walked home in silence, her heart pounding in her chest. The cold night air bit at her skin, but she barely felt it. Mark's words echoed in her mind. "I want you gone." She had failed. After all these years of searching, of hoping, she had finally found him, only to be pushed away. He didn't know who she was, and now she might never have the chance to tell him. Tears blurred her vision as she fumbled with her keys, unlocking the door to her small apartment. The loneliness hit her the moment she stepped inside. The silence was deafening, the weight of her secret pressing down on her like a suffocating blanket. She sat down at the edge of her bed, her hands trembling as she reached for the old photograph on her nightstand. The picture of young Mark, barely 3 years old, smiled up at her from the frame. Her fingers brushed over the image, her heart aching with the loss of all the years they had missed together. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the photo, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, Mark." But no matter how many times she apologized, no matter how much she wished for a second chance, she knew she couldn't change the past. The only thing she could do now was wait, and hope that somehow, someway, she could find a way to reach him. The next morning, Mark arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual, his mood as dark as the sky outside. He hadn't slept well, his thoughts churning all night, keeping him awake. Rosa's face kept flashing through his mind, the look of defeat in her eyes as she walked out of the restaurant. It had bothered him more than he wanted to admit. But why? She was just an employee, an old woman who couldn't keep up with the demands of the job. He had every right to fire her, yet something about the way she had looked at him, as if she had known him for years, unsettled him. Mark shook off the feeling as he stepped into the dining area, already mentally preparing himself for the busy day ahead. But as he moved through the restaurant, something felt off. The place was quieter than usual, and the absence of Rosa, though expected, left a strange emptiness in the air. He found himself glancing at the clock more than once, half expecting to see her shuffling through the door with her cleaning supplies. But she didn't come, and that bothered him more than he wanted to admit. "She's gone," he muttered to himself. "She's not your problem anymore." But no matter how much he tried to convince himself, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that there was something about Rosa, something important, that he was missing. That evening, as Mark was closing up the restaurant, he heard a knock at the door. Frowning, he walked over and opened it, only to find an elderly woman standing there. She was frail, with gray hair and kind eyes, and Mark recognized her immediately. It was Rosa. Mark's jaw tightened. "What are you doing here?" he asked coldly. Rosa hesitated, clutching her coat tightly around her thin frame. "I thought I left something behind," she said softly. "May I come in to retrieve it?" Mark crossed his arms, his expression hard. "You don't work here anymore, Rosa. Whatever you left behind isn't worth coming back for." Rosa's eyes flicked to the floor, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, sir. It's important." Mark stared at her for a moment, then sighed in frustration. "Fine. But make it quick." He stepped aside, letting her into the empty restaurant. Rosa moved slowly, her gaze drifting around the room as if she were saying goodbye. She headed toward the back of the dining area, where her old cleaning supplies were still tucked away in a closet. As she reached for the door, Mark couldn't help but watch her. Something about her movements, the way she carried herself, stirred a strange sense of familiarity deep within him. He frowned, his mind racing as he tried to place the feeling. "Rosa," he said suddenly, his voice quiet. She turned to him, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and hope. "Yes, sir?" Mark hesitated, the words catching in his throat. He didn't know what he wanted to ask her, didn't know why he had called her name. All he knew was that something about this woman was different, something he couldn't explain. But before he could gather his thoughts, Rosa turned back to the closet, quietly retrieving a small, worn bag that had been tucked away. She clutched it to her chest like it was something precious, her hands trembling slightly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice so soft it was barely audible. Mark watched her, his frustration now mixed with an inexplicable curiosity. As she turned to leave, he found himself stepping forward, the question he had been trying to ignore finally bursting from his lips. "Why does this feel familiar?" Mark asked, his voice edged with a confusion he didn't understand. "Why do you feel familiar?" Rosa froze mid-step, her back still to him. Her breath hitched in her chest. The moment she had dreaded for so long suddenly thrust upon her. She didn't know what to say, how to explain the truth that had weighed so heavily on her heart for years. Could she really tell him now, after everything? She slowly turned around, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "There's something you don't know, Mark," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "Something I've kept from you. For a very long time." Mark's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Rosa took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to tell him, she couldn't carry this secret any longer. "Mark, Just then, the door swung open, cutting Rosa off. One of Mark's chef's men barged in, looking frazzled. "Hey boss, sorry to interrupt, but there's an issue with the inventory. We're short on supplies for tomorrow's prep." Mark's head snapped to Ben, irritation flashing across his face. "I'll be there in a second," he muttered. He turned back to Rosa, his curiosity and frustration now blending into a hard edge. "We're done here," he said sharply. "I don't have time for your cryptic riddles, Rosa." The moment was gone. Rosa's shoulders sagged in defeat. She gave a small, sad nod and quietly walked out of the restaurant, leaving Mark standing there, watching her go with a strange heaviness in his chest. The next few days passed in a blur of busy shifts and mounting stress. Mark barely had time to think, let alone dwell on the strange encounter with Rosa. But her absence left an odd void in the restaurant, a void that seemed to gnaw at him in the quiet moments when the rush slowed down. On the fourth day, as Mark was preparing for another packed evening, one of his newer employees, Lisa, came up to him looking nervous. Mark? We're getting behind on the cleaning again. Some of the newer hires don't know how to do things the way Rosa used to." Mark's jaw tightened at the mention of her name. "Figure it out," he snapped, brushing past Lisa. "She's not here anymore. You're supposed to pick up the slack." Lisa hesitated, glancing back at the kitchen. "It's just, things have been harder without her. She used to handle so much." Mark whirled around, his frustration spilling over. "I fired her for a reason, Lisa. She was slow, she was old, and she couldn't keep up. We don't need her." Lisa flinched at his harsh tone but said nothing, nodding quickly before scurrying away. Mark exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Why did everyone keep bringing her up? Why couldn't they move on like he had? Later that night, after the rush had finally died down, Mark found himself sitting alone in the restaurant's empty dining room. The quiet felt heavy around him, and for the first time in days, he let his mind wander back to Rosa. Why had she looked at him that way? Why had she seemed so desperate to tell him something that night? He rubbed his temples, feeling the beginnings of a headache creeping in. He didn't want to think about her anymore, didn't want to deal with the guilt that had started to creep up on him since he'd fired her. But something about the way she had looked at him, the sadness in her eyes, gnawed at him. In the silence of the empty restaurant, he could almost hear her voice again, soft, trembling, like it carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of secrets. "There's something you don't know, Mark," Mark shook his head, trying to push the thought away. But it wouldn't leave him. The more he tried to forget, the more the memory of Rosa haunted him. Frustrated, he stood up and walked to the back of the restaurant, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. He found himself standing in front of the cleaning closet where Rosa had worked for so long, her supplies still sitting there as if she had never left. He pulled open the door, the musty smell of old cleaning rags and disinfectant washing over him. For some reason, he felt compelled to look through the small pile of belongings Rosa had left behind. Among the mops and cleaning bottles, something caught his eye, a small, crumpled photograph, tucked into the corner of the closet. Mark frowned and reached for it, unfolding the edges carefully. His breath caught in his throat as he stared down at the image. It was an old photo, worn and faded with time. In it, a young boy with curly hair grinned up at the camera, his smile wide and full of innocence. And standing next to him, holding his hand, was a younger version of Rosa. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the photo, his mind reeling. How was this possible? Why did Rosa have a picture of him as a child? And why did she never say anything? Mark's hands shook as he clutched the photo, the truth slowly dawning on him. Rosa wasn't just some old cleaner. She wasn't a stranger at all. She was his mother. Mark's entire world tilted on its axis as he stared down at the photograph, his pulse racing. His mind couldn't process the revelation, but the truth was undeniable. The woman he had mistreated, berated, and pushed out of his life had been his mother all along. 1,000 questions flooded his mind. Why had she left him? Why had she kept this secret? And why hadn't she told him when she had the chance? He slammed the door to the closet shut, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to find her. He had to know the truth. Without thinking, he grabbed his jacket and rushed out of the restaurant, leaving the lights on behind him. Rosa sat in her small apartment, the flicker of the single dim light casting long shadows across the room. She hadn't slept well in days, her heart heavy with the weight of the secret she had kept for so long. Every day that passed felt like a lifetime, and each night she wondered if she had made the right choice in staying silent. She knew it was only a matter of time before Mark discovered the truth. It had been too much to hope that she could stay close to him without him finding out. But now that the moment had come, she wasn't sure she was ready. A knock on her door startled her out of her thoughts. Her heart leapt in her chest, and she hesitated before standing up, moving slowly toward the door. When she opened it, there stood Mark, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mix of anger and confusion. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, his voice shaking. Rosa's breath caught in her throat. The moment she had been dreading was finally here. I'll continue the next chapters with the tension intensifying between Mark and Rosa as they confront the truth. Let me know how you like the development so far. Rosa stood frozen in the doorway, the weight of Mark's question hanging heavy in the air. Her lips trembled as she searched for the words that had been locked inside her for so many years. The silence between them grew thicker, but Mark's patience had snapped. "You owe me an explanation, Rosa." He stopped himself, his voice breaking. "Mom." Hearing the word hit her like a punch to the gut. She had dreamed of this moment for decades, imagined hearing him call her Mom again, but never like this, never with so much anger and betrayal in his voice. Mark's eyes burned with emotion. "Why didn't you tell me who you were? Why did you hide?" His voice cracked as he stepped closer, his fists clenched at his sides. "I spent my whole life wondering where you were, wondering why you left. And you were here the whole time, cleaning floors and scrubbing toilets, in front of me." Tears welled up in Rosa's eyes. "I didn't leave you by choice," she whispered, her voice frail. "You have to believe me, Mark. I never wanted to leave you." "Then why?" Mark's voice was raw with emotion. "Why didn't you come back? Why didn't you find me sooner?" Rosa's body shook as she tried to hold herself together. "Because I wasn't good enough. I didn't think I was worthy of being your mother after everything I had done. I thought you'd be better off without me." Mark stared at her, his breath coming in sharp bursts. Better off without you. You think I didn't need a mother? I needed you. Rose's tears spilled over, her heart breaking at the pain in her son's voice. I've spent every day of my life regretting the choices I made. I never stopped thinking about you, about how I could make it right. But by the time I found you, you had already built your life. I was too ashamed to disrupt it. Mark looked at her, his eyes flashing with a mixture of hurt and anger. So, instead of being my mother, you just scrubbed my floors? That was your plan? I thought being near you, even if you didn't know who I was, would be enough, Rosa whispered. I thought it would be enough to see you, to make sure you were okay. Mark's face twisted with disbelief. Enough? You think it was enough for me? Watching you suffer in silence, letting me treat you like dirt, that was enough? Rosa sobbed quietly, shaking her head. I didn't know how to tell you the truth. I didn't know if you could ever forgive me. Mark's chest heaved with emotion, his voice barely a whisper. I can't believe you didn't trust me enough to tell me. Rosa reached out, her hand trembling as she placed it on his arm. I was afraid, Mark. I was so afraid of losing you again. I've already lost you once. Mark pulled away, shaking his head in disbelief. His heart ached with the weight of it all. He had longed for answers, for closure, but nothing could have prepared him for this. I've hated you for so long, Mark admitted, his voice raw. I hated you for abandoning me. Rosa's face crumpled at his words, but she nodded, accepting the pain. You have every right to hate me, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. But please, let me explain. Rosa's hands trembled as she sat down on the worn couch, motioning for Mark to sit. He hesitated for a moment before sitting across from her, his eyes still burning with a mix of anger and confusion. She clasped her hands together tightly, as if trying to hold herself steady. You were so little when I had to leave you, she began, her voice thick with emotion. Your father and I, we had problems. Bad problems. He wasn't a good man, Mark. He was dangerous, controlling. I had to run, or I wouldn't have survived. But I had no way to take you with me. Mark's jaw clenched, memories of his childhood flashing before his eyes. I don't remember much about him. Just that he disappeared too. Rosa nodded slowly. He did. I thought by leaving I was protecting you. I thought he would leave you alone if I wasn't around. But it was the hardest decision I ever made. Mark's fist tightened, his voice low and bitter. So you left me with strangers? You didn't even try to fight for me. Rosa's eyes filled with fresh tears. I tried. I spent years looking for you, but by the time I had any leads, you were adopted. I didn't want to tear your life apart again. I thought you might have a chance at happiness with a family that could give you everything I couldn't. Mark's voice broke. I didn't need everything, I needed you. I know, Rosa whispered, her face crumpling. I know that now. But at the time, I thought I was doing what was best for you. I was so scared of ruining your life. Mark was quiet for a long moment, his mind racing through the years of pain, confusion, and longing he had carried. His entire life had been shaped by the absence of a mother, and now she was here, in front of him. After years of hiding, so you thought scrubbing floors would make up for it? Mark asked bitterly. You thought being my cleaner was better than being my mother? Rosa shook her head. I never wanted to stay hidden, Mark. I wanted to come forward, to tell you who I was. But you were so successful, so driven. And I was just an old woman cleaning your restaurant. I was too ashamed to admit I had failed you. Mark stood up suddenly, pacing the small room, his emotions swirling inside him like a storm. I spent my whole life wondering why I wasn't good enough for you to come back. Wondering what I did wrong. You didn't do anything wrong, Rosa said softly, standing as well. I was the one who failed you. Not the other way around. Mark stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes blazing. So now what? You think saying sorry fixes it all? Rosa's eyes filled with sorrow. No, Mark. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect you to understand right away. I just want you to know the truth. Mark's chest heaved with the weight of his emotions, but he said nothing, his mind too clouded to process the enormity of it all. Rosa stepped forward, her hands trembling as she reached out to him. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I love you, Mark. I've always loved you. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to scream, to cry, to run, but he stood frozen, his mind torn between the anger he had carried for so long and the fragile truth now laid bare before him. He didn't know if he could forgive her, but something inside him shifted as he looked into her eyes, eyes that had watched him grow, eyes that had known the pain of loss and regret. For the first time, the anger started to loosen its grip, just enough for him to whisper, I don't know if I can forgive you. Rosa nodded, her voice trembling. I understand. But I'm here now. I'm not leaving again. Mark swallowed hard, his emotions a tangled mess. He didn't know where this would lead, or if they could ever rebuild what had been broken. But as he stood there, staring at the woman who had given him life, something deep inside him shifted. I don't know what to do, he admitted, his voice cracking. Rosa smiled sadly. Neither do I. The room fell into a heavy silence, but this time, it wasn't filled with anger or accusations, just the fragile beginning of something new, something that might one day heal the wounds of the past. Let me know if you'd like to continue with the following chapters, where Mark wrestles with his emotions and Rosa works to prove that despite the lost years, she will be there for him now. The days that followed their emotional confrontation were fraught with tension, but beneath the anger, something fragile had begun to emerge. Hope. Mark tried to focus on the restaurant, to pour his energy into the one thing he could control, but his mind kept drifting back to the revelation that had shattered his world. Rosa, meanwhile, kept her distance. She didn't want to push him too hard, too fast. She knew Mark needed time to process the truth, to come to terms with the years of abandonment and the pain she had caused. So she stayed in her small apartment, waiting, hoping that one day he would reach out. It was one late evening, after the dinner rush had ended, that Mark found himself standing in front of her apartment door again. His mind was a storm of conflicting emotions, but one thought kept pressing at him. He couldn't keep avoiding her. He needed to confront this, to understand what came next. He knocked, the sound of it echoing in the quiet hallway. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and Rosa stood there, her expression soft but filled with worry. I didn't know if you'd come back, she said quietly. Mark swallowed hard. Neither did I. Rosa stepped aside to let him in, the small apartment feeling even more suffocating than before. He glanced around at the sparse furnishings, at the signs of a life lived in silence. And the weight of everything pressed down on him. Why did you never leave this place? Mark asked suddenly. Why didn't you move on? Start over somewhere else? Rosa lowered her gaze, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her sweater. I didn't want to be far from you. Even if you didn't know who I was, I wanted to be close. It was the only way I could feel like I was part of your life. Mark's jaw clenched. He hated how much her words made sense, how they tugged at the years of resentment he had held onto. And working for me, letting me treat you the way I did? I deserved it, Rosa said softly, her voice full of remorse. I thought, maybe if I could help you, in some small way, it would make up for what I couldn't do before. Mark shook his head, his hands gripping the back of a chair. You don't get it. I didn't want some stranger cleaning up after me. I wanted my mother. Rosa's face crumpled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I know, Mark. I know. And I'm so sorry for everything. I wish I could take it all back. There was a long silence as Mark stood there, his emotions roiling inside him. He wanted to scream at her, to tell her that it wasn't enough. But the truth was, nothing could change the past. The only thing they had left was whatever fragile future they could build. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to forgive you. Rosa nodded, wiping at her eyes. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I just want to be here, if you ever decide you're ready. Mark stared at her, the woman who had disappeared from his life for so long now standing before him, broken and vulnerable. Part of him wanted to hold on to the anger, to let it fuel him like it had for years. But another part, buried deep beneath the hurt, longed for something else, something softer. I'll try, he finally said, the words surprising him even as they left his lips. I'll try to figure this out. But it's going to take time. Rosa's breath hitched as a small, tentative smile spread across her face. That's all I can ask for. The following weeks were slow and difficult. Mark had always been a man who controlled every aspect of his life with precision. But now, with Rosa back in the picture, everything felt uncertain. He had taken the first step in opening up to her, but the road ahead was filled with years of unresolved emotions. They began to meet regularly, small, tentative conversations over coffee or short walks in the early mornings before the restaurant opened. Each meeting was awkward, filled with silences that neither of them knew how to fill. But slowly, the tension between them began to ease. One morning, as they sat in a quiet cafe, Mark finally asked the question that had been gnawing at him since the day he found out the truth. Why didn't you come back sooner? You had time, years even. Rosa looked down at her coffee cup, her fingers tracing the rim. I tried, Mark. I tried to come back several times, but every time I did, I convinced myself you'd be better off without me. I was scared that you'd hate me, that you'd think I abandoned you because I didn't love you. Mark's throat tightened. I thought that for a long time. But now, I don't know what to think. Rosa looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. I did love you. I loved you more than anything. But I was young and scared, and I didn't know how to protect you from your father. I thought leaving would keep you safe. Mark leaned back in his chair, his emotions swirling. I get that now. But it doesn't change the fact that I grew up without a mother. That hurt, Rosa. I know, she whispered. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for it, if you'll let me. Mark stared at her for a long moment, his heart heavy with the weight of it all. He had spent so many years longing for answers, and now that he had them, they didn't feel as satisfying as he had imagined. The pain was still there, but alongside it was something else, something fragile and new. I don't know what's going to happen next, Mark said quietly. But I'm willing to see where this goes. Rosa's face lit up with hope, her hands trembling as she reached across the table. That's all I need, Mark. Just a chance.